The Buxton Memorial Fountain is a memorial and drinking fountain in Victoria Tower Gardens next to the Parliament Building in London. Commemorates the emancipation of slaves in the British Empire in 1834. It was commissioned by Charles Buxton MP and was dedicated, amongst others, to William Wilberforce, one of the main forces involved in the abolition of slavery. In the course of its history, it came into disrepair and was moved around, but then was restored and re-unveiled on the 27th of March 2007 as part of the commemoration of the 200th anniversary of the Act to abolish the slave trade. Today it is mostly ignored by the many tourists visiting the gardens, and I suspect that many MPs in the adjoining parliaments do not know of it either. It is peculiar that a nation so freedom proud has then last year introduced a piece of legislation that will make slaves of hundreds and thousands, if not millions, of its own people. This Act, the nondescriptly named Welfare Reform Act 2009, has dealt a blow to this memorial fountain that no amount of restoration work can remedy. One does not need to believe in utopian, egalitarian societies to wish for some basic standard of decency and civilization. It is indeed a tragedy that aging and maturity bring with them the understanding that a measure of injustice, privilege, and discrimination will always be present in any society. One can only hope for these to be kept in check and abated. A measure of contentment, safety, freedom, and material sufficiency in life is most the average citizens might expect as a natural right and something he or she will hope to pass on to their offspring. A society that provides more of these minimal goals makes for a more productive citizen, willingly to fulfill civic responsibilities, more law-abiding, and spurred into efforts to improve the efficiency, quality, and fairness of society. This is a tremendous force of progress and explains why more repressive societies seem always to be lagging behind the more liberal ones. The old Soviet Union springs to mind, but many more examples could be found in history. This is probably one of the reasons why nations with higher labour costs are also socio-economically more advanced. Would not be so societies that maintained some sort of slavery and therefore the minimum possible labour costs would have been the better off ones instead. The importance of maintaining a minimum standard of wages to motivate the workforce was recognised in the introduction of the National Minimum Wage Act 1998 and is still officially supported by the party of government. For instance, the Labour Party Business Secretary maintains that the minimum wage also creates a level playing field for business, making a huge contribution to the UK's economic success. One could sum up saying that the wealth of a nation and her people, the better off they are morally, materially, and proactively, the richer the nation. Lots of definitions have been written about what slavery is, but fundamentally, it is safe to assume that if someone is coerced to work under threat of possible life-threatening consequences, one doesn't stray far from the common meaning of the word. The charity Anti-Slavery International, founded in 1839, the world's oldest international human rights organisation and the only charity in the United Kingdom to work exclusively against slavery, states its definition of slavery as forced to work through mental or physical threat. The deeply unjust and oppressive Welfare Reform Act 2009 does just that. In its 125 pages, the Act institutes the power to direct claimant to undertake specific work-related activity, together with a long list of sanctions to compel claimant into it. It is both stupid because it haughtily underestimates the resisting power of its victims and is murderous as it will kill many vulnerable people. New modern private slavers will be able to sell and rent out slave labour, and there is hardly any mention of statutory check on their behaviour and compliance with their official functions. The Act at a stroke creates a pauper underclass stuck in a vicious cycle that will prevent its victims from helping themselves and improving their lives. These immoral and insane legislative ideas were inspired by figures like Professor Richard Layard, that oddly enough specialize in happiness studies. From shallow premises like inactivity breeds misery and despair, he arrived to the conclusions that we need to prevent long-term unemployment by adopting the activation approach, in which after some point it becomes impossible to receive support except through activity. To his credit, even he seemed to think that people should have to be paid for their forced work, but everyone knows that the way to hell is paved with good intentions. As for happiness, well, nobody's perfect. The other main advisor for the bill was Baron David Anthony Freud. He was appointed to provide an independent review of the welfare system and recommended to expand the private sector involvement in the welfare system for substantial resources to be found. Eventually he left the Labour Party to join the Conservatives that have many rabid anti-welfare proponents. The sponsors of the bill were James Purnell, a disgraced former minister, famed for boasting of stopping doctors double-guessing bureaucrats in deciding whether benefit claimants were fit for work, and Lord Mackenzie of Luton, someone so out of it that when asked about the sponsored bill and how many people with mental illnesses would be treated, thought sufficient guarantee to say that their work advisors would provide additional explanations to them. The resulting law they concocted, and the one the majority of MPs of both Labour and the Conservative persuasion voted for, has resulted in an invitation for private bids for forced labour supported by a very crude anti-scrounger witch hunt. This is sadly in line with a piecemeal loss of rights and freedoms occurred in the UK in the last decade or so. The plethora of restrictions and increased surveillance and police powers is entirely consistent with the need to cope with an emergent underclass of dispossessed and disenfranchised proletariat. The meaning of all this is that evil is present in our midst, and one does not need to wait for dramatic illustrative events to realize how far has grown. To ensure its success, one only has to be unresisting.